Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
The basement of the Brooklyn brownstone. The New York City apartment that wouldn't let him sleep. A Brooklyn brownstone horror. My first apartment in New York City was a garden-level unit in a classic pre-war brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Calling it garden level was generous. It was a basement, but for a 20-something graphic designer like Ethan, the price for that square footage was a miracle I couldn't refuse. The downside, however, was immediately apparent: the noise. The floor above me was the original, ancient hardwood, and I could hear everything. Every creak of the floorboards, the low throbbing bass from the tenant's speakers. I even knew when he dropped his keys. It was the rhythm of city living, I told myself, a constant, annoying, but ultimately normal human presence above my head. The sounds took a sharp turn into the bizarre 2 weeks after I moved in. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the city finally sighs and falls silent. I was jolted awake by a noise that wasn't a footstep or a dropped item. It was a strange, sustained, dragging sound. It wasn't the sound of heavy furniture being lifted. It was the sound of something heavy and soft, like a thick, wet canvas sack being pulled slowly across the raw, exposed hardwood directly over my bed. Slish, drag, slish, drag. It would start near the front window, travel agonizingly slowly across the entire length of the living room, and stop precisely in the center, ending with a soft, dull thump. It sounded final. I grabbed my phone, the screen blinding in the darkness. I texted the tenant whose number I had stored under upstairs noise. "Hey man, are you moving furniture right now?" No response. I waited. The dragging started again, slow and methodical, the sound magnified by the silence of the rest of the building. The sound intensified. It wasn't just dragging. There was a new, sickening wetness to it. Slish, slosh, drag. It sounded like something bleeding out onto the floorboards and being slowly smeared across them. A terrible, primal nausea rose in my throat. I grabbed a heavy wooden broom handle and banged it twice on the ceiling. A sharp, aggressive thwack. The wet, rhythmic dragging stopped instantly. The silence that rushed back in was so absolute, it felt like a vacuum. I listened, my ear pressed against the cold plaster. Nothing. No movement, no breathing, no music, no human sound whatsoever. 10 minutes crept by, each second louder than the last. Finally, trembling slightly, I lay back down. The next morning, I saw the superintendent in the hallway and asked him about the noise. He looked confused. "Noise from the upstairs unit? That's impossible. It's completely vacant. That's why Ethan got the cheap rent." That single sentence shattered my reality. That night, I didn't wait for the sound to start. I waited for the silence to break. At 2:58 a.m., it happened. Not the dragging, but a faint, guttural, choked whisper. It wasn't coming through the floor. It was coming from the ventilation duct near the ceiling. It was muffled by something thick, wet, like it was talking through a swollen tongue or a sack draped over its head. The words were slow and strained. "You
I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my keys and my jacket. As I fumbled with the locks, the whispering stopped, and the heavy, wet dragging started up again, faster this time, moving with an unnatural, frantic purpose. It raced back and forth above me, a horrifying ballet of wet sound. I could hear the squish where it picked up speed, and the slosh as it changed direction. I threw open the door and scrambled up the steps to the street, running until the frigid November air burned my lungs. I never went back. I lost the deposit and all my possessions. A few weeks later, the police contacted me. The landlord had called them after finding my empty apartment. They said the upstairs unit was exactly as the superintendent described, vacant, dusty, and dry. But on the center floor of that empty apartment, precisely where the dragging had always stopped, they found a single, deep, claw-like scratch mark that penetrated the ancient hardwood. It wasn't blood they found, but an unsettling, viscous fluid that smelled sharply of brine and something intensely metallic. The report simply listed the case as unspecified vandalism. But I know what it was. I, Ethan, had woken the thing that lived in the floorboards of that Brooklyn brownstone, and it had finally learned to talk.
Story 2. The GPS Glitch on Interstate 10. Title: The GPS sent me to the middle of nowhere, Texas. I-10 road trip horror. The drive from Phoenix to Houston is grueling. A marathon of asphalt, diesel fumes, and endless, desolate horizon. I was a week into a solo cross-country move, and by the time I hit West Texas, Michael, was running on caffeine and sheer willpower. I was desperate for anything that promised a shortcut. That's when my car's inbuilt GPS piped up. The voice was smooth, automated, and undeniably American. Take the next exit, exit 310, for a route offering a minor time saving. Exit 310. It led onto an unpaved service road that had clearly not been maintained since the 1970s. The dirt quickly dissolved into scrubland and rocks. I cursed my foolish optimism, realized the system had glitched, and slammed on the brakes. I pulled over onto the shoulder, kicking up a small cloud of dust. The road was utterly deserted. No lights, no distant glow from a town, no cell service, just the immensity of the Texas sky above me and the suffocating silence of the desert. I tried to re-input the freeway entrance coordinates. That's when the GPS screen went completely dead. Not a fade, but a stark, immediate blackout. A moment later, it flashed back on. The map, the navigation lines, the car icon, all were gone. The only thing on the screen was a simple, stark white text box centered on the black background. It read, "Follow the signs." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself it was some ancient software error. I looked up. There were no road signs, no street markers, just the scrub brush in the endless dark. I looked back down at the screen, and the text had changed, the white letters glowing with an eerie intensity. It now read, "No, look behind you. Follow the signs you missed." A cold electric dread seized me. I slowly, reluctantly, turned my head to look into the vast black back seat of my SUV. Nothing. Just my luggage and the shadow cast by the faint dome light. When I looked forward again, the text box was gone. The screen was filled with one single, blinking, relentless word: closer. I fumbled for the ignition, key trembling in the slot. I had to get out of here. Before I could turn the key, the automated, smooth American female voice from the GPS didn't come from the dashboard speakers. It came from the space directly behind my head, right next to my ear. It sounded close, breathy, and deeply, unnervingly calm. You should have paid attention to the road signs, Michael. They clearly stated, "Do not stop under penalty of the road." Now, the road will come to you. The car began to shake, not a tremor, but a violent, sustained rattling that felt like someone was aggressively vibrating the tires. The radio screamed a high-pitched static. I tried to start the engine, but the key wouldn't turn. It was locked. Through the rear windshield, I didn't see the desert or the highway. I saw an impossibly high wall of dark, wet, glistening soil rising up from the ground behind the car, moving forward. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless and colossal. It looked like an entire stretch of the interstate, packed dirt and asphalt, being peeled up and driven toward me by some immense unseen force. I realized the dark, wet texture wasn't soil. It was a mass of compacted earth, wood, and metal, a mobile mountain of Texas road. I screamed, pushing myself flat against the steering wheel. In my side mirror, the rising wall of earth was now just feet away, casting the cab into absolute shadow. The last thing I heard before the impact was the GPS voice, now deep, distorted, and resonating with a gravelly sound, whispering, "Welcome to the middle of nowhere, your home." The sound wasn't a crash. It was a dense, wet thud as the weight of the endless Texas road came to a complete, final stop against my back bumper. I, Michael, haven't moved since. The air conditioning still runs, but the windows are sealed with dirt. The GPS screen still blinks, but it only says one word, over and over: home.
Story 3. The Shadow on the New Jersey Turnpike. Title: Caught on the toll booth camera, the shadow that followed me from the New Jersey Turnpike. The New Jersey Turnpike at 4 a.m. is a study in industrial gloom. I, David, was driving back to Philadelphia from a long business trip in New York, completely exhausted. The toll booths near Elizabeth were almost deserted. I pulled into the empty Easy Pass lane. The machine beeped, acknowledging the charge, and I watched the tiny red light on the security camera, the one that snaps your license plate, flicker, taking my picture. As I accelerated away, I glanced into my side mirror, a habit I picked up from too many late nights. For a split second, in the clear, harsh fluorescent light of the toll canopy, I saw something in the back seat. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't a shadow cast by the lights. It was a shape. Tall, skeletal, and unnervingly thin, like a cheap suit draped over a flimsy wire frame, but entirely, absolutely, perfectly black. It was slouching, its elongated head leaning against the back window, facing the rear. Adrenaline hit me like a shot of ice water. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. I drove for 5 miles, pushing the speedometer past 80, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. I pulled over onto the shoulder, threw my briefcase onto the floor, and spun around, gasping. The back seat was empty, just the pale gray leather of my sedan. Nothing but the clothes I'd tossed there, and the faint smell of stale coffee. I tried desperately to rationalize it. Exhaustion, reflected light from a passing truck, a trick of the toll booth's harsh directional lighting. I sat there for a full 20 minutes, forcing myself to breathe, convinced I was losing my mind. Then, my phone chimed. It was an email alert from the Turnpike Authority. Your Easy Pass photo has been successfully processed and attached. I opened the attachment. It was the standard black and white harsh flash photo of my car passing the toll booth. The plate was clear. The back of my head was visible, but the camera had captured something else, something the human eye was meant to dismiss. In the back seat, visible just above my right shoulder, was a shape, a column of absolute darkness. It wasn't slouching anymore. It was sitting bolt upright, and its featureless, jet-black head was slowly turning toward the camera lens. It looked less like a shadow and more like a tear in the fabric of space that had decided to take a seat in my car. I zoomed in, hands trembling. The final frame of the photo captured the exact moment its face, or lack thereof, was directed at the camera. There was no definition, no texture, but in the center of the black mass, there was a single, tiny, pale, agonizingly slow glint, the reflection of the toll booth light in something that felt like an eye. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and drove. I didn't slow down. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, then the side mirror, then turning my head. For the next hour, nothing. Silence. Just the road and the low, distant lights of the suburbs. When I finally reached the safety of my driveway in Pennsylvania, the sun was just beginning to rise. I didn't stop. I drove my car into the garage, hit the remote, and watched the door come down, sealing the space in darkness. I, David, rushed inside, locking every door and window, and collapsed onto the living room couch. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go near the garage. Around noon, curiosity, or perhaps pure dread, compelled me to look. I walked to the kitchen, knelt down, and looked through the small, dusty window in the garage door. The car was sitting there, exactly where I left it, but the driver's side door was open, and sitting precisely in the middle of the empty, dusty garage floor, facing my house, was the slender black shape. It was sitting cross-legged, perfectly still, patiently waiting, and I, David, knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who has seen a photograph of his own terror, that it hadn't followed my car. It had merely used the car to transport itself. And now that I had brought it across state lines and locked it in the garage, it was home.
Story 4. The Last Call at the Cincinnati Radio Tower. Title: The DJ Who Vanished After Reading a Note Live on Air. Cincinnati Midnight Broadcast. My name is Max, and I was the ghost of late-night radio. My shift at WCMT, a nearly defunct AM station broadcasting from a rusty tower outside Cincinnati, was 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. It was pure dead air, a playlist of forgotten 70s rock, automated voice tracks, and silence. My only company was the hum of the ancient server racks and the faint smell of ozone. I rarely got calls, no one was awake. One frigid, silent night, around 3:15 a.m., the fax machine sputtered to life. Yes, a fax machine. It was a beige, brittle relic from the 80s, kept around for legal paperwork, and it hadn't worked in years. But now it was feeding paper. The sheet came out blank, except for a single perfectly centered line of text written in a cramped, almost aggressive hand. "Max, read this on air, word for word, or else." I laughed nervously. A prank, some local kid testing how far he could push the last surviving DJ in the county. I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. 10 minutes later, the machine whined again. The second sheet came through. Same text, same handwriting, but now another line was added, scrawled underneath with hurried intensity. "You have exactly 30 seconds to start. The listeners are waiting." My throat went dry. The specificity was chilling. I unfolded the paper. I leaned into the microphone. My voice, usually smooth and low, coming out shaky and thin. "Okay, folks, this is bizarre. I just got a bizarre note here at the station. I'm going to read what it says. It appears to be a list of names and a list of things to do." I started reading the names. They weren't celebrity names. They were local names, people I knew, the chief of police, the station manager, the owner of the local hardware store, my own mother. After each name was a brief, horrifying instruction, a specific gruesome action related to their home or routine. The details were intimate, evil, and chillingly precise. I felt physically sick as I spoke the words into the microphone, terrified the police were listening. As I read the final instruction, an order for the local police to report immediately to a specific, deserted intersection miles from the station, the heavy, ironclad door to the studio, which I had personally locked and bolted hours earlier, creaked slowly inward. There was nothing there, just the absolute blackness of the unlit hallway. But the piece of paper in my hand began to vibrate violently, buzzing against my palm. I stared at the door, then back at the fax. The final line of text on the paper began to change, the ink running and spreading like fresh blood, dissolving the fibers of the paper. It now read, in that same aggressive scrawl, "Now that you know what to do, Max, it's time to start. They're here." Before I could tear the microphone cord out of the console, the entire studio went dark. The only emergency light was the faint red on-air bulb, which pulsed slowly, painfully. The last sound captured on the emergency broadcast recording was the microphone falling to the floor, followed by the sound of a voice, not mine, but a deep, distorted, inhuman whisper, singing an off-key, sickeningly cheerful lullaby. When the police arrived at dawn, the station was empty. The bolted studio door was wide open, and the fax machine was gone. They found the crumpled paper on the floor, but the names and instructions were gone, replaced by a dense, circular stain of dried, metallic fluid. I, Max, was never found. But every night, exactly at 3:15 a.m., the radio tower outside Cincinnati briefly comes back to life. It doesn't broadcast music. It broadcasts a single, clear, American female voice, the voice of the old automated DJ, reciting a list of names and addresses in the area. And at the end of every list, it says, in a voice that sounds like my own, "Now that you know what to do, it's time to start."
Story 5. The Locked Room in the Miami Airbnb. Title: The Hidden Room I Found in My Florida Rental,
The Miami Beach Airbnb. The Miami Beach Airbnb was a dream. Sleek, minimalist, all-white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a spectacular view of the Atlantic. I, Sarah, was there for a week of peace. The only strange element was a small, unassuming utility closet located off the kitchen. It was secured by an absurdly heavy, industrial-grade padlock. When I messaged the host, I got an immediate, curt reply. Storage for cleaning supplies. Do not touch or attempt to open. I respected the boundary until the third night. I was finally asleep after a long day on the beach when I was abruptly awakened by a repetitive, soft scratching sound. It was coming from the kitchen wall, precisely behind where the utility closet was located. It wasn't the frantic scurrying of a mouse. It was the distinct, deliberate sound of a fingernail dragging vertically down a wooden surface, then lifting, then dragging again. Wrist, wrist, wrist. It was slow, agonizingly patient. I crept to the kitchen, my feet cold on the marble. I put my ear to the heavy wooden door of the closet. The scratching stopped instantly. I held my breath. I heard a muffled sound, like someone clearing their throat in a soundproof space, followed by a distinct, sharp hissing, the sound of a human breath being drawn in sharply, maybe in surprise or distress. Terror replaced annoyance. I rushed back to my phone, ready to call the host and demand an explanation for the locked space and the noise. As I reached for the light switch, I noticed it. A tiny hole drilled into the wood of the closet door, no bigger than a pinhead, perfectly hidden just behind the thick brass padlock bracket. It looked professionally bored, almost surgically clean. My hand shaking, I put my eye to the hole. I expected to see darkness, a void, or maybe the faint gleam of cleaning supplies. Instead, I saw light. A warm, steady yellow light, like a single antique lamp, was burning inside. And in the center of the illuminated, strangely detailed room, I saw an antique rocking chair. In the chair sat a woman in a heavy, dark dress, her back ramrod straight, facing directly toward the door. She wasn't moving, but she wasn't blurred. Her stillness was absolute, her face obscured by shadow. I pulled back, a scream catching in my throat. I stumbled backward, heart hammering a frantic beat against the marble counter. I didn't look for nearly a full minute, running through every possible rationalization, a pipe, a hallucination, a reflected light source. Finally, I forced myself to look again. The light was gone. It was absolute darkness. I looked a third time. Nothing. The next morning, the padlock was gone, vanished. The closet door was ajar, swung open maybe 2 inches. I pushed it open slowly. It wasn't a utility closet. It was a shallow, narrow space, barely 3 feet deep, leading to a blank wall. There was no room for a chair, certainly no room for a person, and no room for a lamp, just a dusting of construction debris and the bare sheetrock wall. But taped to the inside of that blank wall, precisely opposite where the pinhole had been, was a faded photograph. It wasn't of the condo. It was a picture of the condo's kitchen, taken from the perspective of the inside of the closet. And in the background of that photograph, standing by the sink, out of focus, was me, turning and looking directly toward the closet door. The date stamp on the bottom right corner read, "Yesterday's date, 3:07 a.m. The host never replied to my frantic calls. I, Sarah, checked out immediately. When I called the management company, they told me the condo unit did not have a utility closet off the kitchen. It had a load-bearing column. The entire closet, the wood, the door, the padlock, was a brand new, purpose-built fabrication constructed to hide a single pinhole and a single sickening picture. I still see that rocking chair every time I look at a dark corner, knowing the woman who sat there didn't follow me home. She just had my picture, and she knows where I am now.
Story 6. The Children of the Yellowstone Cabin. The last things I saw before leaving Yellowstone National Park. A cabin rental nightmare. The cabin we rented was advertised as rustic wilderness retreat, unplugged. It certainly delivered on the remote promise. I, Jason, was there with my wife, Sarah, and our children, 8-year-old Ethan and 4-year-old Lily. It sat on the edge of the wilderness border near Yellowstone National Park, surrounded by deep woods, high pines, and the kind of absolute, overwhelming silence that city dwellers dream of until it becomes oppressive. The first night, the children, Ethan and Lily, refused to settle. They kept talking about the others. The others are outside, Dad. The others want to play with my toys. I checked the windows. Nothing but the endless woods. No other cabins, no lights. I was firm. There are no others. It's the woods. Now go to sleep. The second night, I was asleep when a weight landed on my chest. I woke with a gasp. It was Lily, my youngest. She was completely soaked. Her pajamas were cold and damp, covered in tiny, sharp pine needles. "The others got me," she whispered, her eyes wide and staring past me. I checked the bathroom sink. It was bone dry. I checked the doors and windows, all locked from the inside, the latches cold to the touch. I tried to warm her up, but she remained cold and utterly rigid, staring. The third night, I couldn't sleep. The silence had taken on a tangible weight. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted by a rhythmic, unsettling tapping sound. It wasn't on the window, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the wooden floor right at the foot of our queen bed. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Like small, precise knuckles knocking on the floorboards, exactly where the children's feet would have been if they were standing there. I nudged my wife, Sarah. "Did you hear that?" She didn't answer. She was asleep, but her eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling. I reached to shake her, but she was stiff, impossibly rigid, her skin clammy. The tapping stopped. Then from the darkness at the foot of the bed, a tiny, high-pitched voice, exactly like my 4-year-old daughter's, spoke from the floorboards. Mommy told them to be quiet now. They listened. I threw the covers off, my mind splintering. I swung a wild kick at the foot of the bed and shone my phone's flashlight beam. Nothing, just the dark, bare wooden floor. I raced to the children's room. Ethan and Lily were in their beds, covered to their necks, completely motionless. Their eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, just like Sarah's. I ran back to my room, grabbing Sarah and shaking her violently. She finally moved. She looked at me, a blank, cold, terrifyingly satisfied smile stretching her face. She raised her hand, her movements jerky and unnatural, and pointed a finger, a tiny, impossibly small finger, too small for her hand, at the floorboards. "The others are waiting for you too," she whispered. Her voice was not Sarah's voice. It was Lily's voice, but deeper, resonating with a wet, hollow sound. I, Jason, didn't think. I ran. I burst out of the cabin, leaving my keys, my wallet, and my family behind. The cold Yellowstone air hit my lungs like ice. I kept running until I reached the main road, not looking back. The last thing I heard as I ran into the freezing, deep woods was the sound of my 2 children laughing, a high, unnatural, ringing sound right behind me in the dark. I finally reached a ranger station, miles away, collapsing into the doorway. When the rangers finally went back to the cabin, it was empty. The door was locked from the inside. They found no trace of my wife or children, but they did find one thing. On the floorboards at the foot of the master bed, where the tapping had been, were 4 small, perfect, muddy footprints. They weren't a child's prints. They were the prints of a small animal that walked upright, and they ended precisely where the carpet began. The police listed the case as disappearance in the national park. But I, Jason, know where they are. They are with the others, and they are still laughing